In the 16th century, Tudor House was lived in by the Cottrell family who worked in Worcester's broadcloth trade. Christmas would have been a bit different for the Cottrells as it is today, but there are still elements of the celebration that we would recognise. In the Tudor period, people often decorated their houses with evergreen leaves like holly, ivy and mistletoe hung in kissing boughs from the ceiling. At the great courts and palaces, there were huge celebrations at Christmas time, which began on Christmas Day and went on for the 12 days of Christmas afterwards. Things would probably have been a bit more modest at Tudor House. The Cottrells made a good income from the broadcloth trade, but they weren't among the super wealthy. Nonetheless, at Christmas time, this would have probably been the one time of year that the looms fell silent, as the Cottrells and the apprentices they employed stopped work for the duration of the holiday. Over the Christmas period was the one time of year in the 16th century that no free man could be compelled to work. Christmas food in the Tudor period was a little bit different to today as well. Although the Tudors did have mincemeat pies, in Tudor times these would be made with actual meat, and some recipes call for more meat than others. One recipe called for mutton or lamb to be used to represent the shepherds who went to visit the baby Jesus during the Nativity. Another recipe, however, called for I think I'll stick with the modern version. Food also inspired some of the carols the Tudors sang, including possibly the Cottrells right here in Tudor House. In the 16th century, some Christmas tunes that we're familiar with today, such as While Shepherds Watched or Good King Wenceslas, were familiar tunes to the Tudors too. But other carols seem to have fallen out of fashion. The Boar's Head Carol, for instance. This described how a wild boar would be sacrificed and its head served on a platter surrounded by a herb garland. This was a traditional delicacy at Christmas time, but I think it's another one that we should leave for the Tudors. Carol singing was the tradition that the Victorians actively sought to revive. Many new Christmas carols were written in the 19th century, including Silent Night, Away in a Manger, Once in Royal David City, and O Little Town of Bethlehem. These carols were probably sung here in Tudor House, especially right here in this bit, which was then the Cross Keys Tavern. The Victorians also popularised many Christmas traditions that we're familiar with today, most famously perhaps the Christmas tree. Prince Albert wasn't the first person to introduce Christmas trees to Britain, but he did help to popularise them, such that by the mid-19th century they were a common feature in homes across Britain. Christmas trees were decorated with paper cornucopias such as these, and also strung with dried fruit and nuts, which would be hung with pretty ribbons from the branches. This was probably really good news for one set of Tudor House residents at the time. From the 1870s to the 1890s, Tudor House was rented by William and Martha Wood, who used the building to run their haberdashery business. We don't know exactly what they sold, but earlier this year we made an exciting discovery which might give us a hint. When the restoration work was undertaken on the 16th century plaster ceiling upstairs, Hales and Howe, who undertook the restoration, had to take up the floorboards in the attic to get to work on the ceiling from above. Underneath these attic floorboards, they discovered lots of really interesting items which we're still working on cataloguing and restoring, but among them were buttons, scraps of fabric and a few bobbins. Although we can't be sure, it's very likely that these slipped down one day while the Woods were busy at work, and this is the last remaining evidence of their haberdashery business here. On Christmas Day, the Woods probably ate goose and not turkey. Goose was traditionally eaten for most Christmas meals during the Victorian period, and even the very poorest usually managed to afford it. Think of the Cratchits in Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. Meat was still expensive, and for working class people, one of the ways they could afford to buy a goose for Christmas Day was to participate in a goose club. This was where they put a portion of their wages aside each throughout the year, which was then used at Christmas time to buy the goose. Goose clubs were often run by pubs and taverns who would look after your money for you until Christmas time. We don't know if one was run at the Cross Keys Tavern, but perhaps we'll make it our mission to find out in 2021.